A couple of weeks ago, I released my video about the ultimate DIY bowl gouge. It's patterned after the Oland tool that a lot of woodworkers have been using for 20 or 30 years, but my version is quicker and easier to make. And since I released that video, it's gotten a good response. A lot of people have watched it. In fact, if you haven't seen it, maybe you better go take care of that and then come back and watch this video. Anyway, the gouge itself works really well. I've turned a bunch of bowls with it, they've been quick, and the results have been really good. In fact, I like this gouge so much that I made a second one, and a third one, and a fourth one. Now, you might be asking yourself, why did you make 4 of the same tool? I didn't. I made 4 different tools, and each one does a different thing. Which does make a lot more sense when you think about it. Here are my 4 tools up close. I've got the small Oland and the larger Oland style tool. These are really good for bowls and faceplate work. They handle roughing and hollowing. The small one's good for more detail work, and the big one is really good for being more aggressive or handling hardwoods like oak. This tool is patterned after a round nose scraper. It's smaller than the scrapers you usually use for bowl turning, but it does a lot of the same things. It'll handle roughing, not quite as aggressively as one of these tools, but it also leaves a smoother finish because of that nice round radius there. It handles a lot of shaping tasks, especially putting radiuses and curves on different details, and you can work on the inside of a bowl with it too. This last tool is a square nose scraper. It's really similar to the square radiused roughing tools that a lot of the carbide companies are putting out. It's mostly straight across, but then the corners are knocked off just a tiny bit, so as you move it back and forth across the work, it doesn't dig in and it leaves a nice smooth finish. That's what I mostly use this tool for, getting a finish on my work after I'm done with the roughing tools. This tool is also actually 2 tools in one. I can take it out and then flip it around, and I've got a radiused scraper that I can use for doing the insides of bowls and doing the transition between a bowl bottom and a bowl side. It's not quite as good as some of the commercial scrapers that I've used, but it does work and leaves a nice finish, stays sharp for a long time, and I think it's going to improve the more I learn about sharpening it and getting the geometry right. This is a soft maple flower pot that I've been turning here and there over the last couple of days. It's a good wood that's going to show us how each one of these tools performs. What I want to start off with is working on the rim here. I don't like the way it slopes up towards the top. It should either be straight or slope down. And so this is a good opportunity to use one of my roughing tools to take off a lot of material quickly and re-establish this geometry. Now in the last scene where I showed the close-up, you might have noticed that my roughing tools have more of a point on them than a traditional bowl gouge does. And I found that as I've been using them, the point is really good. It allows me to dig in, establish the depth I want, and then move the tool to one side or the other to take off material in a straight, consistent line. You'd think that having a rounded tip would work better, but it doesn't. I do better, more accurate work with a point, and pretty quickly I rough out exactly the surface that I'm looking for. Like a traditional bowl gouge, I can also use the side of the tool for a shearing cut. It's not quite as good as a scraper, but it is effective at cleaning up the rough cut that I've done before and getting the bowl ready to use a finer tool. Now I've got a straighter line here and a pretty good finish. That shearing cut did a good job, but I can do better even before I go to sanding. Now I'm going to move over to my square-nosed scraper and go back and forth a little bit to clean up that cut and make it even flatter. Now that finish is actually almost clean enough that I might not have to sand any of this. The long grain is really good. I've got a little bit of tearing on the end grain, but that's something that you expect. I'm going to sand that a bit, maybe even manual sand it to get it to come out, but the scraper's working really nicely. The next thing I want to do is refine some of these details in here. I've got the basic shape worked out, but the transition between the body of the pot and the rim could be a little bit more graceful. The best tool for this is my small Oland tool. It's got a nice sharp point, just like my big one does, but it's more delicate and it can get into small spaces better to do details. Now the exterior of the pot is really looking exactly the way I want it to. I've got a nice sloping transition from the bottom to the top, a little bead detail, a rim, and a nice flat outer section. And everything's been scraped pretty clean. It's not going to need much sanding. Now let's move on to hollowing. I could do the hollowing with either of my Oland style tools, but I'm going to go with the big one, mostly because it's sharp and it'll get the job done quickly. The sharp point on this tool is useful for hollowing too, because it's going to let me define a rim. And then I can work from the rim towards the center or the center out towards the rim, and the straight sides of the tool will take off material either way. I can get the hollowing done pretty quickly because the tool is robust and it takes off a lot of material with each pass. Once I've got the hollowing underway, I might switch to my large round nose tool. It's easy to take small and medium-sized cuts and it leaves a clean finish. I can go from the inside of the bowl towards the outside without the tool digging in or knocking the work free of the chuck. It's a little bit slower way to hollow, but it's safer. Sharpening these tools is easy. You're going to want to use your rough grinding wheel and a platform, but you can do it freehand. You don't need any jigs. There are only two things you have to worry about to sharpen a custom tool like this: tool shape and tool clearance. The shape is created on the top of the tool like this. So this is my straight scraper, and it's more or less sharpened straight across with the corners just knocked off a little bit. Grinding the shape is easy. I'm going to push the tool directly into the wheel until I see sparks come over the tip just a little bit. Then just at the corners, I'm going to move it side to side just a tiny bit to establish a little bit of a radius. I'll establish this, and then I'll worry about making sure that I have clearance. Now clearance just means the tool has to be swept away underneath the cutting edge so that when it comes up against a piece of wood, there's space in between the edge of the tool and the bevel. You don't want the bevel dragging against your workpiece as you're cutting. Getting the clearance on a tool like this is easy. It mostly depends on just getting the tool rest set correctly. In this case, the tool rest being perpendicular would be like this, but I've got it up just a couple of degrees. So when I put the tool against it and just rest that against the wheel as it's turning, it automatically grinds in a couple of degrees of relief so that this cutting edge hits the wood and the bevel down here doesn't touch anything. If I have the rest set correctly, everything else just takes care of itself. I'm going to use a really similar setup to grind my round nose scraper. It's pretty much the same thing, it just needs a couple degrees of relief here, so the same tool rest setup is going to do it for me. I'm just going to put the nose against the scraper and then rotate it back and forth until I have a nice smooth radius. Now for my Oland tools, I used to use a jig like I would use for a spindle gouge, but recently I've found that freehanding it is quicker and gives me better results. The geometry here is pretty straightforward. It's just a straight line from the edge to the tip, and I grind it with just a little bit of a radius, which helps it give a smoother cut. It's the same thing on the other side, and I can easily do that freehand. I let the tip be a nice sharp point because that lets me define rims and dig in when I need to. For this kind of freehand sharpening, I don't worry too much about where the tool platform is. A couple degrees up from parallel to the floor is all you really need. I go back and forth along each edge of the tool until I have a nice shape that I'm happy with, and I make sure the tip has a nice point to it. Then I have to worry about the relief. Now I used to do this part with a jig, but what I've realized is that I can just roll the tool up along the wheel like this, moving it in a sweeping motion and grinding away anything extra. Also, the nose of the tool sometimes needs to be ground down, and I can do that by turning the tool 90 degrees and just sweeping it into the wheel so that the heel gets ground away. When I'm done, the tool looks more or less like this. It's got a sharp point, two smooth cutting surfaces, and a nicely relieved heel on the front. To do my curved inside bowl scraper, I do pretty much the same thing. I sweep the scraper along the wheel in a nice shallow arc to get this geometry established. I want to make it the smoothest, fairest curve that I can because that's going to give me the nicest finish inside the bowl. Then I have to worry about clearance, and here it's a little bit more complicated because of the curved shape. You can see that it's swept down here, but then I also have to sweep it down along the curve, so it takes a little bit more shaping on the wheel. I do that by getting the geometry set first on this edge and then slowly rolling it down, moving the heel of the tool more and more into the grinding wheel and grinding away as much material as I need to. The completed tool has kind of a faceted look because it's tough to get that clearance established really smoothly, but all that matters is that this part right here, the leading edge, contacts the wood and then everything else is relieved away. This grind is going to work really well, and the finish I'll get on the bowl should be nice and clean. When I first started making these custom tools, I was just trying to find a bowl gouge that I didn't have to pay a lot of money for. I didn't really think much beyond that. But the more that I've been working with them, the more I'm realizing that this system of having a tool bit set into a shaft is really flexible. You can make a lot of the turning tools that you'd usually have to spend money for. Now, you can't make everything. For instance, you're probably going to have to shell out and buy a regular old skew chisel. That's fine, they're not too expensive. At the same time, you can make hollowing tools, roughing tools, flat nose scrapers, round nose scrapers, all sorts of things out of tool bits with a little bit of grinding. At this point, I'd even feel comfortable making a custom tool that I just needed for one project. If I needed a special shape to do hollowing under a rim or to do a particular kind of detail, I'd just go to the grinder and make it out of a spare bit. It wouldn't even take very long. I've only been working with these for a couple of weeks and I've already come up with 5 different shapes that I use frequently. So this video is not about showing you all the ways that you can possibly do it. It's about showing you how flexible this system is. I'm sure a lot of my viewers are smarter and more experienced than I am. So once you've made one of these tools, go ahead and get a couple of extra bits and start experimenting. I bet with a little bit of time you can come up with all sorts of useful shapes that you can use in your turning and you can put together really quickly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.